First of all, I want to thank you for coming out today. I want to thank my former student back in 2009, probably 10. I know you graduated then, but yeah, that's pretty cool to come here. I've been retired for almost a decade, so it's always nice when I see a student show up, former student. I live in Culpeper, and one of my former students' father runs one of the restaurants there, so I ran into them one time in the last couple of years as well. Stephanie Carlaza, I don't know if you remember her, but she was a 2009 grad too. Today we're going to talk about the Summer of Discontent and Content, what I kind of call it, which it really was. You mentioned Creswell, and Creswell talked about this summer when he was here. One of the things he says, man, all anybody in Virginia wants to talk about is Boston, the shutting down the harbor in Boston. So he kind of relayed the message that was the big thing in Virginia. So that's what we'll talk about today. I did quite a bit of research on this just because in the last couple of years, I had a lot of people asking me if their county had a resolves. And I knew some of the counties that had resolves, but I didn't know how widespread it was through Virginia. And so I went down that rabbit hole and ended up educating me on how many resolves were written in Virginia in 1774. Now I know we're about a year off from this. It was probably a hotter topic last year, but it's good as we enter the 250th to understand what Virginia and the importance of Virginia played in this, which you'll see tonight. I'll try to get out of your road here, those of you that are in the front. Everything working out all right as far as technology? Good. Okay, I'm going to kind of take you through a little bit what Mr. Gillespie took you through earlier, but kind of get you up to the point of 1774. 1748, we had the Ohio Company of Virginia, and that really kind of kicked things off. The Ohio Company of Virginia was a company which we were trying to expand to the West. It had some of the most important leaders in Virginia. Thomas Lee, Richard Henry Lee's father, was involved with it. The governor at the time was Dinwiddie was involved. They were investing in lands west of the Ohio River Valley. And of course, George Washington's older two brothers were involved. Nathaniel Chapman was involved. Later, George Mason will become involved. So this was part of the larger important people in Virginia. We're investing, trying to get the governor in Britain to recognize this so that they could have land to develop to give away to settlers. And the trouble with that, and you'll see it right here, the trouble with that is it ran right into what the French were also trying to claim. So the French were claiming this area just west of the Ohio River Valley. And the British are now putting out a claim in it, supported by the Parliament, supported by the governor here in Virginia. And that's going to kick off an immediate confrontation with the French, which will lead to the French and Indian War in 1754. The governor Dinwiddie sends a young George Washington out to see what the French are doing and to let them know that they were trespassing on British soil. They considered the British trying to trespass on their soil. And when George Washington came back to Williamsburg, gave a report, basically the French were not leaving. And as a result of that, the next year, Dinwiddie sent forces out headed by George Washington, not initially, but it was under Joshua Fry, but Joshua Fry ended up having a fall off a horse, which he died from. And it eventually elevated George Washington to the top of that, which ended up having a short fight with some French forces, which led to a lot of finger pointing, which led to the war in 1754. And that war was not good for the French. British forces eventually win that war. Of course, Virginia was very proud. We were part of the British. We appreciated, opening up the West, having no barriers. We kicked the French out of here. The French, by the way, will lose all their territory in Canada, and all those French that we think of from Montreal today, they were left without a country. You know, they were there, and the British came in with pretty lax rule as a result, but the British ended up with all of Canada and of course the colonies in North America as well. So because of that war, it was very costly for the British, very costly for the British government coming out of that war, and they needed to impose funding ways to finance what they'd gone in debt for. So they thought it would be a good thing to force the American colonists to pay part of that war for that war, just because they figured that they were the ones that were benefiting from this war. And what we had with the French and Indian War, we had the French and Indian, but when the French were defeated, the Indians weren't going anywhere, the Native Americans. They were here, they were going to continue fighting. And that's what we found out as more settlers moved over into across the Blue Ridge. They resisted. The Native Americans resisted. A lot of American settlers were getting killed. And so doing what American settlers did, they cried to Great Britain, say, put up forts, defend our Western settlement. We've got that now defend us. And so they put up a series of forts and had a series of forts out here, which again is going to cost the British government a lot of money. So as a result of that, too expensive, they're already deep in debt, so they decided, we'll come to a solution to this problem. We'll just put a line across here, which we will not allow colonial settlement past. That was known as the Proclamation Act in 1763, where they put this proclamation line right here. And of course, to Virginians, that was a slap in the face. Because for us, the reason we were in that war was to go out and settle the frontier. So now you're telling us that we can't go across that line because it's causing problems with the natives. So that was the first real rub for Virginians, that Proclamation Act, because that's the reason. These are some of the forts that were put up to defend against Native Americans. And then of course from there, and I'm not going to get into this much detail with here, you know most of the story, that the Stamp Act in 1765 was put on all paper goods. It impacted everybody in the colonies. If you were a wealthy attorney, your legal papers were taxed. If you were a lower life gambler, your playing cards were taxed. So it hit all levels of American society over here, colonial society. We rebelled. They pulled back they rescinded that in 1766, but they put in place the Townshend Acts, would put other taxes on various goods. Now, it wasn't like Virginians hadn't been taxed before. We'd been taxed a lot before, but we were always taxed locally within the colony at the House of Burgesses. Each parish had their taxes fixed where they were collected at various parish churches, and they were collected for our own local service in the colony. The reach of Parliament had not come in here and put taxes. We had no representation in Parliament. Virginians did. Our representation was in the House of Burgesses. So that was important to us, that they were starting to reach into our pocketbooks from London. So all these things progressed to the point, and obviously the worst problems are in Boston. Boston felt the impact of a lot of these taxing decisions more than Virginia did, especially. You have New Englanders, they were different than we were in Virginia. They came over here more as a religious reasons. They were separatists. They came over as pilgrims and then Puritans later. And so their focus of life was around the church and not as much agriculture. When they tried to farm, they found out that their climate that far north and their land was not built for making a lot of money on agriculture. So they did what anybody would do. They had to figure out some way to survive. And they did. They were very creative. They came up with manufacturing. They came up with a lot of, goodbye. Thanks for stopping by. Take care and tell Kevin hi. They were trying to do what they could do. And they, as they said, they were very innovative. They realized that shipping, you know, some of their natural resources, lumber, things like that. So they were reaching in all different areas to try to make things work. And they had a very thriving economy. doing that type of thing. And was kind of competing against Great Britain. So they felt the heat of Great Britain almost immediately. And when they started pressuring Great Britain eventually will bring in some forces to calm them down. And that will lead to the Boston Massacre of 1770, which Paul Revere made a pretty good print of here, which was a pretty good propaganda piece that to inform the colonies about the abuses of the British. And then of course we have, this is the tipping stone right here. 1773, the British were trying to flood East India tea on our shores. Very cheap tea. The East India Company was very aligned with a lot of investors that were in Parliament, and they had a surplus of tea. They were going to dump it in America. Low cost, but it had the tax on it. So we were at that point rebelling against the reasons for the tax. And we had a number of people dressed up. Now, a lot of people in history think that these were Mohawk Indians. They were dressed purposely as Mohawk Indians, but they were really just disguising themselves. They were dressed in a lot of different types of disguises, mostly because they didn't want the authorities to figure out who they were. So you disguise yourself. They weren't all dressed to look like Native Americans at the time, but this is the thing that really changed things. The British London Parliament was not happy at all about this. As a result, the British response to the Boston Tea Party was what became known as the Boston Port Act. Now, in history, we talk about the Intolerable Acts, and they were a series of acts that took place in about a 7-month time frame in 1774. But the first one was the Boston Port Act. This reached American shores in late May, early June of 1774. It took a distance, a little bit of time frame. It's not like now we can communicate internet all the way across the world in a fraction of a second. It took time to get across the ocean, to get the news what Parliament was doing. And this landed on the shores of the colonies early June 1774, and this was going to shake things up. Now, a lot of people say that it was, like I said, the Intolerable Acts, but the other 3 Intolerable Acts weren't passed till a little later. This was May 20th. It did not arrive in the colonies, news of it till early July, or even into late July, these other 3 Intolerable Acts that made an impact. But the Boston Port Act made an immediate, it closed down the port of Boston. Now, if you're in the Boston area or New England, closing down the port of Boston was your lifeblood. It was something that you could not afford. And most of the other colonists realized that was so important. I just want to quickly go through the royal governors and how they reacted. Some of these I'm going to point out. I went through when I was doing this project to see how all the royal governors reacted at the time. And I'm going to point out just a few that were there on some of the responses to what the legislative bodies were doing within their colonies. Maryland's Sir Robert Eden was the governor, and he was the last person. What he did, he prorogued the House, so basically never called them back. It was basically shutting down the government, the colonial government, kind of what we're in right now. He shut down the government. He just refused to call it back into session. So as long as they weren't called back into session, they couldn't do anything. That's one of the responses. Virginia's John Murray, Governor Dunmore, he was the only governor to dissolve a standing House body, a standing legislative body, while it was in session. And I think that's going to be a big issue with Virginians, because he ends up upsetting the most important leaders from each of the 61 counties in Virginia. And it's one thing not to be called up when you're all separated in your home counties, but when you're in Williamsburg and he shuts you down, that had an immediate important impact. Virginia reacts to the Boston Port Act. Virginia burgesses had been convened since May 5th. The news of the Port Act came to them while they were in session. And on May 24th, the House of Burgesses, and I should mention, the House of Burgesses, the Virginia's government was set up in two. It had the council, which were appointees of the governor, usually appointed by way through the king. And then you had the lower house, which was the House of Burgesses, that 2 members from each county were voted upon to set in Williamsburg and pretty much the people's body. And so that's what was in session, the House of Burgesses. They immediately, all of the business that was going on immediately kind of shut down, and their focus was totally on the Boston Port Act and what Parliament was trying to do. In May 24th, they designated June 1st in their legislation as a day of prayer in response to the news of the Boston Port Bill. The Burgesses stated the hostile invasion of the city of Boston, their sister colony in Massachusetts Bay, whose commerce and harbor are to be stopped by an armed force, deem it highly necessary that the said first day of June be set apart by the members of this house as a day of fasting, humiliation, and prayer. That was all it took to get Dunmore very upset. This is the whole resolution signed by George Witt, and which was published in posters, and it was also published by the Virginia Gazette. And when Dunmore read that, he said, quote, this act was conceived in such terms as reflect highly upon His Majesty in the Parliament of Great Britain, which makes it necessary for me to dissolve you, and you are dissolved accordingly. So he dissolved the House of Burgesses. He said his response was that act of Boston, when they dumped that tea over into the harbor, that was a criminal act. And in today's money, it was in the millions of dollars of destruction of property. So he looked at those people as just nothing to be thieves and all of that. And he looked at what the House of Burgesses did in support of what happened, those terrible people in Boston. So he acted, and he talked about how could the House of Burgesses embrace those hostile, illegal activities of what had happened in Boston. He said, you can't do this. So that was kind of the reason for him shutting down the House of Burgesses. And of course, doing what all good Virginians do when they're out of work, where do they go? They go to the bar. Let's go to the Tavern Ordinary. So they ended up going to Raleigh Tavern. In New England, they'd have probably gone to church, and prayed about the situation. But they went to Raleigh's Tavern right here. And a replica of Raleigh's Tavern is still in Lovettsville. You can go there today, pretty much built on the same footprint. But 89 of the justices or former Burgesses got together, they drank. And to be honest, it was the largest room in Williamsburg. So it was the place that they had previously gone to when they had to have extra legal political meetings they'd gone to. So it wasn't like this was something that they'd never done before. But they met at Raleigh Tavern. They were there for a couple of days. On the 27th, remember the other act, their official act was May 24th. So 3 days later, they passed this, which I think is a very important document, because this is one of the first documents in all of the colonies where all of these men signed their names in protest against the crown. I mean, this is almost a treasonous act. And not only was it almost a treasonous act, but you signed your name to this document. So basically they're condemning what had happened. They're condemning Dunmore, and they're calling for economic reprisals against Great Britain. And they signed their name, 89 of them. Francis Peyton was here in Loudoun County, was one of the justices Burgesses that was there at Raleigh Tavern. A lot of the important ones were there: George Washington, Thomas Jefferson. If you go through the list, you're going to see the cream of the crop of Virginia aristocracy. So most of the Burgesses had home. That's when on 3 days later, on May 30th, they get, Virginia gets a correspondence from Baltimore, which had been come down from New York and what Baltimore had done. And they were calling for a unified meeting with all the colonies to get together. And so having this correspondence coming down from Maryland, where it was talking about what other news they'd heard from the North, that's when Peyton Randolph, and there's his home. He was the primary leader. He was a Burgess from Williamsburg and one of the leading Burgesses. He'd had a variety of the leading offices within the House of Burgesses. He ended up rounding up other Burgesses that were still left in Williamsburg, and he found 25 of them. 25 of the 89 were still there. And they drafted this document giving direction to the Burgesses in all of the counties of Virginia. Now remember, there are 61 counties in Virginia. They decided to let everybody know what was going on, that they were calling for a meeting of all the colonies. And they put this very wording in their document as they signed it. Quote, and it's in bold here, "We fix the distance day." Now they called for everybody to come back to Williamsburg on the 1st of August and come ready to do work about what our response is going to be with the Boston Port Bill now that the governor shut down the House of Burgesses. Now, think about this. The House of Burgesses were the vocal point of the British government. You shut down the House of Burgesses, we have no voice. All these counties do not have a voice, a political voice. And this was a time period where anxiety was ramped up very high. So they decided they were going to meet on August 1st with an extra legal body. And they said, "We fixed this distant day in hopes of accommodating the meeting to every gentleman's private affairs, and that they might, in the meantime, have an opportunity to collecting the sense of their respective counties." That's key. Basically, they were telling every leader in their counties, get together in your counties, see what the sentiment is of your counties, and write it down, come back here, and we're going to discuss some of the main ideas for our response as a colony. That is huge. And it was, of course, signed by 25 of those. Some of those that were still there, Edmund Pendleton. Edmund Pendleton, of course, becomes one of the leaders of the First Continental Congress from Virginia. You've got George Washington still remained there. So some of Thomas Nelson. So you had some of the more important leaders were still left in Williamsburg. Now, Fredericksburg. Fredericksburg has always claimed that they had the first resolves. And I know where that came from, because in the 1970s, there was a very good attempt to put all the resolves together that were written. And Fredericksburg in that writing it was stated that they had the earliest that they could find. It was June of 1774. But Prince William County, and I'm going to back up a little bit, Prince William County actually passed resolves in Dumfries on May 31st, the day prior to Fredericksburg. I kind of leave those two out because Fredericksburg or Dumfries, Virginia, which were the county seats of their respective counties, neither one of them had political standings in the House of Burgesses. They had political standings through their counties, but both of those wrote resolves from their towns ahead of their actual county resolves. And that's where Fredericksburg claims that they were the first resolves, but actually the town of Dumfries was a day ahead. That's recorded, primary source document, a day ahead of Fredericksburg. But on June 6th, the very first county resolve, the very first resolve that was written that had standing in the House of Burgesses, that was Prince William County on June 6, 1774. And because of that, these are their resolves. They hit the most important points that most of the counties will later hit. You have to understand that they were the first to pass, which eventually become at least 45 counties passing resolves. 45 of 61 counties. Here they all I went through and I documented as many primary sources. Now, one of the best primary sources was actually going to the Virginia Gazette. Virginia Gazette printed most of these. But what problem the Virginia Gazette had, now think about this. These were all done in June and July for the most part, 2 months in 1774. 2 months in 1774, all these different counties got together and coined resolves. Now, the June resolves, there are about 8 or 9 resolves that were done in June. Most of the resolves are done in July from here down. 45 of the resolves of the 61 counties were passed by August 1st. August 1st was the deadline in which they were supposed to go to Waynesburg and meet. And what we'll talk about these, here's the Fairfax County resolves that everybody talks about forever. I should mention that the Loudoun County resolves were the third county to pass resolves on June 24th. They were pretty quick. Now, what advantage did these resolves, these later July resolves, have over the first county resolves? Yeah, it's like, give me an idea and then I'll expand upon it. So those first counties, they were doing it on their own, somewhat isolated. It isn't as if they were in a vacuum, because a lot of these ideas sprung out of what would happen in the Raleigh, in the Raleigh Tavern, and those ideas as they went back to their counties. So they heard the debate points, but the first counties are the ones that actually delivered without having read any other resolves. And I condemn Fairfax County on this all the time, because Fairfax County, the 250th, they had the big resolves last year. They were the national resolves and all that. And it mostly is because Fairfax County jumped on it 50 years ago. They really started touting their resolves. And because George Washington and George Mason were attached to those resolves, it gets a lot of play. But by the time the Fairfax County resolves, that was July 18th, almost all these other resolves, you could read them in the Virginia Gazette. So they had all the resolves at their access when they actually come up with it. Now, I will say there is a difference with the Fairfax County resolve. It had George Mason's handwritings in it, his thoughts. It was much better laid out, much more thorough. And especially looking at the historical analysis, they went and they really analyzed really well the history of how the interpretation and how those things change from the earlier colonial times, the treatment of Great Britain, to the last 20 years or so. And they really did a good job of analyzing it, but they didn't come up with any original ideas. Here's Loudoun County's resolves. Now, Loudoun County was one of those resolves that does not show up in the Virginia Gazette. Almost all the other ones do, or mention. Loudoun County does not. Loudoun County has a history where it was found in papers later on. I actually think it was found in Richard Henry Lee's papers later on. So it was discovered in the late 19th century. And it was published in the early 20th century. In 1904, the William and Mary Quarterly published the Loudoun resolves. Now, one good thing about the Loudoun resolve that a lot of the other resolves do not have, because it was in Richard Henry Lee's papers, it was all the members that signed it were written. Now, a lot of the resolves, when they were published in the Virginia Gazette, they just published the resolves. Sometimes the secretary, but usually nobody's that signed the resolves were ever captured. And many of those resolves, unfortunately, have been lost to time over the years. I recognize that resolves aren't a sexy subject. When you get to the Revolutionary War, it always becomes more important. And actually, the last battle becomes more important than the earlier battle that just happened, because that's the way history is. And the determining battle, such as Yorktown, that takes a higher prominence than other previous things. So when it comes to resolves, it kind of gets lost to history. But the resolves, to me, were so important in setting the stage. And if you look at the context of these resolves, they're pretty important. Now, I don't know, those of you that are from Loudoun County, I've studied Loudoun County quite a bit. just because I was in Prince William a lot, and Loudon used to be part of Prince William. It's part of Stafford, then Prince William, then part of Fairfax. In 1758, it breaks away. And so a lot of these names are familiar to me, but I'm sure if you look at them, they're familiar to you too, in this room of that colonial time period. So just to emphasize, throughout June and July of 1774, Virginians made it known that they were not willing to accept any restrictions to their rights and liberties. By the first week of August, 45 of Virginia's 61 counties. This kind of shows you the map. All that darkened area, every one of those counties produced resolves that summer. Now, there are 10 frontier county resolves out here that are counties that did not produce resolves. And I pretty much agree that they probably did not have resolves. They had another thing going out on the frontier in 1774. And some of you probably know it. It was Lord Dunmore's War. They had a lot of problems. They were afraid to move very far from their homes to go somewhere. And they, in the fall of 1774 especially, so they were really caught up in Lord Dunmore's War out here with the Shawnee and other Native American groups out in the frontier counties. So that was a good reason. Now, many of these counties will come up with their own resolves in the spring of 1775, such as the Fincastle resolves. So they come late to the party. They were not around when the First Continental Congress, but they will publish resolves in response to that. But to me, the important resolves are those that were stated before August 1st, 1774. And so you've got, if you take their resolves out, that's 45 of the 51 counties had resolves. And those that did not have resolves are these right here, these three, King and Queen County, and then Northampton, Southampton over here. Those are the only ones. I am pretty confident that these three counties here probably had resolves that we just have not discovered them. Probably these two as well. I'm pretty confident though that King and Queen County here did not have resolves because both of their Burgess leaders became loyalists. So I'm sure they put a thumb in things to make sure that their county never got to the plate when it had resolves. But when you look at that, my goodness, these resolves were just amazing as far as the amount of resolves that Virginia had written in 1774, all of them in June or July. Now, some of these resolves, we don't know what they stated. About 36 of the resolves, we've got the text. The other resolves, we know that they were printed, or that we know that they existed because the Virginia Gazettes, and there were two at the time, they were published resolves as much as they could, but it took their entire papers. And finally, they had so many resolves coming in by July, late July, that they just listed the counties that they'd received resolves from because they recognized, they would say like, all these resolves have similar ideas and writings. So I'm just going to list them because we have not enough room in the paper to print all the resolves. But because they listed them, I'm pretty confident that they actually told the truth. And some of these are confirmed in both Gazette papers where they existed. They just were never printed. But you look at that, you know, Louisa, Goochland, and Cumberland counties, Southampton and Northampton. I'm pretty confident that these four, especially Northampton, just because they were on the other side of the Chesapeake, maybe, maybe not. But King and Queen County here, when you look at that, and that's what I'm going to do now is I'm going to just briefly take you some of the major points that these resolves had in common. And here I list where the first resolve was printed. Now, obviously, if you're the first county producing resolves, you're going to get a lot of the high points. So Prince William had 4 of the top items: right to be governed, taxed by themselves. Parliament had acted unconstitutionally. Prince William stated that with their first resolve. Stop imports, you know, talking about Boston suffering by unconstitutional act, stopping the courts of justice, those types of things. And then, of course, Frederick County and then Loudoun. Loudoun is the first county to put in at the expense of our lives and fortunes, which to me is a pretty bold statement. when you state that you're going to defend Virginia at the expense and of your life and fortune, you're giving it all. Right here, I go through these because I went through every one that existed. I kind of checked off which ones they had that were similar. And then I looked at how common they were. Submission to the king. Now, this is in the first 20-some counties. We wanted to divide the parliament from the king. So we were putting all the blame on parliament. And we were hoping that if we said we will submit to the king's wishes, but this is against parliament, hoping to put a wedge in between the king and parliament, it didn't work out. By the end, the king was signing everything that parliament was pushing as far as the those other intolerable acts. But initially, we were trying to divide the two. That parliament's to blame. We submit to the king's wishes. Right to govern ourselves. 30 of the 45 counties. Now, I only have 30 some of these 35 counties that I have the text of, but 30 of the counties. Enforcement of coercive acts could bring on civil war. 5 counties suggested that. Stop imports, 29 counties. Boston suffering was highest, 32 counties talked about Boston suffering. At the expense of our lives and fortunes, which Loudoun County was the first one to say. Culpeper County said the same thing on July 7th, Essex County on July 9th, and Fairfax County, which had already copied pretty much every other resolve, did it on July 17th. Call for an end of slaves or convicts. 8 counties made that statement, calling for an end of slavery, import of slaves. On that one, you've got Culpeper County was the first to say that, and 8 of the 30-some say that. Talking about, and many of them recognize the damage that the British were forcing upon us, sending slaves and slave ships over to the counties. So that's kind of a breakdown, which ones were the most important that were coming out of the counties. Now, one of the things that I mentioned earlier, which the Committee of Safety stated in Williamsburg, the opportunity of collecting the census of their respective counties. To me, this is one of the most unusual things about these resolves. Think about that. Most of them start out with at a meeting of freeholders and other inhabitants of the county. That's usually how they start out. Think about that. Freeholders, but most of them say other inhabitants of the county. You don't have to be landed gentry. You didn't have to be a property owner. Many of these counties say this was an open meeting. I don't know in your lifetime, but I've never witnessed it hardly any time in American history where counties have come together at a meeting place and they debated and then they write down their grievances publicly, sign them, and send them to be published. That's an unusual act. I mean, to this day, all through American experience. And these guys were doing it county by county by county. And if you think about that, if you're doing that county by county, what are you doing? You're locking in all the inhabitants that came to that meeting. You pledged whatever it was came out of that meeting for the defense of Virginia in response to what the British were doing up in Boston. That's a pretty solemn pledge for those. Now, we're a year away from a war. But what this was doing, it was locking Virginians in for war. This was the pre-course that got everything ready to roll. I mean, to me, it's just so important of what they were doing with bringing in the inhabitants and freeholders. I will go on and say the importance of all these resolves cannot be overstated, especially in Virginia. We became Boston's closest friend. Virginia was the wealthiest and most populated of all the colonies. Their commitment against the actions of England became paramount in the success of the Revolution. When Lord Dunmore dissolved the House of Burgesses, the result was to disenfranchise and anger leading members of each county, which he did. I mean, they were the leaders. The result of that disenfranchisement was obviously the various resolves. The Democratic action was Virginia's first step to declare independence 2 years later. In doing so, the county freeholders and inhabitants bought into the upcoming struggle while producing a purely Democratic set of documents which show a united clarity of purpose. These resolves fortified the commitment to the ever-strengthening common cause of America. Governor Dunmore, during the 1774 Summer of Discontent, helped unify Virginians for war, something that Massachusetts and other colonies needed in the following years. It was solid in Virginia. And here again are the resolutions from Loudoun County. What I did as well, this is my working chart. I'm just going to take you through my working chart. Whenever there was a new resolve, when you went through all the existing resolves, I would look at the resolves, what it was of the counties and when the date was. And when there was a new resolve, I would put 2 X's by it. And as we went through all the resolves, and I did that for every resolve in every county as it went forward, so I could kind of then number and see how consistent some of these counties were. And here you're going to see Fairfax on the last resolve. Fairfax did not bring anything new to the table, but it's the only county that had every single point of every previous resolve in it. So when people say they were the most thorough resolves, that's true. Were they most deeply written resolves? That is also true. But it's like taking someone's ideas and then expanding on them. Not that George Mason and those didn't also have those ideas, but when you come that late, I mean, they were literally almost 5-6 weeks after the first resolves that were being written. So I look back when I was in college days and we had to write a paper and I'm getting the ideas of everybody else. Then after I've got all their ideas, I'm kind of polishing them, adding to them. And that's to me what I see Fairfax, you know, I was out of town. I was actually in Europe last year, and I was I'm president, currently the president of the Culpeper chapter of the Sons of the American Revolution, Culpeper Minutemen chapter. I was asked to talk at the event last year in Fairfax County. I had a pre-commitment that was over in Europe, so I couldn't do it. And I was thinking, maybe they really don't want to hear me at the Fairfax resolve as the national. Now, I would have toned it down, obviously. But it has always bothered me a little bit that Fairfax gets so much recognition when others were leading the charge and writing these resolves in the original voice over them. Now, something that I also did as part of this project, I went through every single county and identified who their House of Burgess members were. And so you've got all the counties. These are all the House of Burgess members in 1774, the last gasp for the House of Burgesses. And what I did, I went through, and those counties that are bolded, those are counties that actually produced resolves. And those that are bolded men in those counties, those are men that that were part of the 25 committee of correspondence that were in Williamsburg and wrote out that they're directed to the various counties. And those that are underlined, the underlined members, those are all members of the 89 Burgesses that were in Raleigh's Tavern. So this chart gave me a lot of information. I knew what counties were doing it. I could reflect on the counties. For example, if you look at Loudoun County, 2 Burgesses, Thompson Mason, I cannot find him anywhere. Now, a lot of these, because the House of Burgesses was just getting started in session, some of these Burgesses had not yet made it to Williamsburg. I found that in at least 2 or 3 cases, and that might have been Thompson Mason's problem as well. I know that one of the Burgesses, Blackburn, out of Prince William County, he does not show up on the original list that was at the House of Burgesses and does not show up at Raleigh's Tavern. But he does show up as a member of the 25 in the Committee of Safety. And when I do research on him, he just got there late. You know, he was there for the bulk, would have been there for the bulk of the session, but some men had other commitments and they were just arriving late. But in Loudoun County, you've got Francis Payton was one that was involved. He was also at the session, was at the Raleigh Tavern, etc. And as I go in here, 55 Virginia's almost 90% had members that had signed that. If you go to King and Queen County, no resolves. George Brook and J.T. Corbin, neither one of them were at Raleigh. Both of those two men ended up as loyalists. So that kind of tells me that maybe that county probably had enough leadership against what these other rebellious patriots were doing. But this tells you a lot when you look at some of this and break it down by county and who was in those counties. Obviously, I'm going to give a little plug for one of my ancestors here, and he is actually in Fairfax County. George Washington and John West. John West was one of my ancestors. His first cousin helped found Loudoun County. His name was William West. He ran West Ordinary, which was out by Bull Run Mountain. And that's where the breakaway from Fairfax County, he was one of the original trustees for the town of Leesburg, had a lot of that. That was John West. Now they're descended from the governors West. Thomas West, Lord de la Warr, they're actually descended from John West, who was the colonial governor of Virginia through that line. So that's where that line comes from. But John West, I always refer to him as being the senior member in Fairfax County House of Burgesses, because he preceded George Washington by about 3 or 4 years. So George Washington was the junior one. But another thing that I think is funny about the Fairfax County resolves is that George Mason, who everyone lauds for its writing, he was the third signature on that document. The first two were George Washington, and John West was the second signature, who nobody mentions. And there's a reason for that. John West dies. He resigns after the session as they're just starting to get. He dies in 1775. It's kind of like the resolves. If you don't survive the Revolutionary War, you're kind of lost to history. So he was an older man, did not survive, and they've kind of written him off. Even though you look at the document of the Fairfax resolves and his name's ahead of George Mason's on the scheme. But from these resolves, they met on August 1st as the first Virginia convention. This would be the first of 5 conventions that Virginia would have. And they hammered out those different items that the counties brought to them. At that convention, both Francis Payton and Thompson Mason were there. Many of the items were approved at the First Virginia Convention in August 1774. Some of those items end up in the Articles of Confederation in 1781, First Continental Congress, Articles of Confederation, and some of those ideas also end up in the federal Constitution that came from Virginia's ideas here. And one of those is slavery. This is Prince George's County resolved that African trade is injurious to this company or this country. Those are 3 examples. First Virginia Convention came up with this: we will neither ourselves import nor purchase any slave or slaves imported. First Continental Congress, second, has not to import or purchase slaves imported after December 1st, 1774. Of course, the United States Constitution has that the migration of importation of such person, which is not to go into effect until 1807. But all of those initial ideas or statements come from out of the counties in Virginia that keep getting carried through into the most important one. Now, I also took a look at all the other colonies, and this is almost impossible. I know there's holes in this because other counties didn't care about the resolves much and how many there were, but these are the resolves I could find in other colonies at the time that were written. And most of these resolves, these are 1775 resolves here. There's only 2 in 1774. Pennsylvania has some resolves that have survived. Connecticut has 1. Massachusetts, South Carolina, Charleston, New Hampshire. New Jersey had quite a few resolves written during that summer of 1774, especially considering the number of counties. The three by far colonies that had the most surviving resolves are Maryland. They had 16 counties. They had about 10 or 11 of their 16 counties produce resolves, New Jersey and Virginia. But when you look at Virginia's, they're just so dynamic because they were so large. We had 61 counties compared to a lot of these just didn't have. Maryland had 12 counties, at the time. It was just, so I want to do a plug as we wrap up today, because we've got the 250th anniversary of the Culpeper Minute Battalion coming up in 2 weeks. Actually, next week, we're starting with activities. Culpeper Minute Battalion was very, very important. It's one of those things that's been lost in history. They were the only, just a quick thing, 3rd Virginia Convention decided they were going to have to get organized very quickly, so they organized 16 military districts. This military district was called the Prince William Military Districts. It included Fairfax, Loudoun, and Prince William County, 3 counties. Usually 3 to 5 counties were in a military district. Each military district was to come up with 1 regular company and 1 10-company minute battalion. Now, the regular company was supposed to join the 1st and 2nd Virginia down in Williamsburg. They were going to make up the bulk of that 16 companies that 8 in each of those 2 regiments headed by Wolford and Patrick Henry. And the minute battalions were supposed to be large, 580-man minute battalion to come to the defense of your region. And there were 16 of those. Only 1 of those fulfilled their obligation, and they did it in 3 weeks. That was Culpeper. Culpeper Military District made up of Orange, Fauquier, and Culpeper County. Within a week, they had put together a rifle company and sent it down to Williamsburg. They became the senior company of the 1st Regiment. Loudoun County was pretty quick. They were the 3rd of the 16 to get down there, Prince William, Fairfax, and Loudoun. But some of those companies didn't show up for about 2.5, 3 months. And so what happened was Culpeper Minute Battalion formed and was completely formed in 3 weeks, unheard of. 3 weeks, they put together a 580-man company. And that, if you did the populations then and now, that's like putting together thousands of men in 3 weeks' time and having them drilling and mustering. I mean, it was unheard of. What happened, Colonel Patrick Henry, realizing that he was getting a real problem, he didn't have enough ranks for the regular companies making it to Williamsburg. He'd heard news that the Culpeper Minute Battalion had formed. So he had to send a message to hurry up and come to Williamsburg, we need you. So they did. They marched to Williamsburg, and as a result of that, they became very involved in all of the important early battles. They were the deciding factor in Hampton, Great Bridge. They provided the largest number of manpower at both of those battles and fought all the way through to kick the governor out of the state by the summer of 1776. So the field that they mustered on was the largest muster, drill, and deployment field in all of Virginia in 1776. So that's what we're celebrating in the next 2 weeks. I just want to let you know, to invite you all to come down to your neighbors down south in Culpeper County or even Fauquier County, because they were part of the Culpeper Minute Battalion and the Culpeper Rifle Company. But they were unusual. There are only 2 minute battalions that formed out of the 16. And the other one didn't completely form until December. The Culpeper Minute Battalion had formed in early October of 1775. And they were needed in a time of desperate need for Virginia, and they responded. So we're trying to educate the people about the importance of that. I also have a few books here today. If anybody, I have like 4 or 5 that I published 2 years ago. This won the National Book of the Year Award from the Sons of the American Revolution. And it's totally different subjects. It's about George Washington. It's about the end. I was writing a book on the early childhood of George Washington from 0 to 21. And I had to deal with Parson Weems because Parson Weems is the man that told about the cherry tree story. And he was his first biographer, the Prayer Valley Forge. So I just happened to live about a mile from where Parson Weems lived in Prince William County, and where he wrote those stories when I was teaching in Prince William County. And the more I taught local history for 25 years, and I followed it up from Jamestown all the way up as it developed and all the way into Virginia. And what I came to realize was what those historians are saying about this guy isn't at all accurate. It's not anything that I'm researching on the ground level. So this book is an attempt to straighten out. And since then, I've got another professor on board in Georgia. He's on board. He wrote an article with me this summer. We presented at the Naval Academy in June about George Washington's 10 greatest dilemmas and decisions of his life. And the conference started off with the cherry tree dilemma at the age of 5. So that's what this book's about. It basically destroys historians' writings about George Washington's cherry tree story being a lie and a myth. The guy that wrote it was a very respected minister in Virginia and Maryland, and he just happened to be very closely married to one of George Washington's close cousins. And his wife's grandfather was in partnership with George Washington's father, Gus Washington, in Stafford County, north of Fredericksburg. And Nathaniel Chapman, they were all Ball family members, closely related. They would have known all those stories. And so that's what this book's about. It has a lot of George Washington's younger history in it. But with that, I will conclude and I'll take any questions. Yes.
We do need to get our baskets out so that you can make a donation to help us to pay the church, the use of the church. We much appreciate it. Yeah, okay.
I will set flyers up there. These are for the Saturday the 25th, which is our big day in Culpeper, a whole day of activities in the park, the muster field, and also that evening we've got a big reunion dinner of descendants of the Culpeper Minutemen. We're recognizing descendants, everyone's welcome, but we're recognizing descendants who are still alive today and their ancestors were part of the Culpeper Minute Battalion. So I'll put these out here while you're going through that.
Bruce.
All right. Your questions, please.
Yes.
Could you summarize the 10 greatest dilemmas of
The ones, it was his entire life. I dealt with his younger age, but some of his decisions had about hanging Andre during the Revolutionary War. His issue of Fort Necessity was another one of his dilemmas. Just a number of those throughout his life. They carried through obviously from the cherry tree story at the age of 5 to the end of his life. So people ask me about George Washington and they say they put other leaders ahead or presidents ahead of George Washington. It's like, come on now. This guy was driven. 17 years old, he becomes the youngest surveyor in the history of Virginia, today or then. 17 years old, he becomes a surveyor in Culpeper County, Virginia. And a friend of mine and I last year found his exact location of his very first public work, which just happened to be his first public survey. I can take you within 10 feet where he started that survey, and 48 years later, his public career ended after 2 terms from the president back to Mount Vernon in 1797. So you look at that and you go, Washington was driven. But this is about Washington, but my God, the guy. French and Indian War, House of Burgesses, Revolutionary War, commander of all the Continental Army, going against an empire, the greatest empire in the world, the Constitutional Convention, presiding over the Constitutional Convention, becoming the first, inventing the presidency. Tell me who else that's ever been president could even match that. And as part of it, he was giving orders at Valley Forge and then giving his overseer orders what he needed to do that week at Mount Vernon. He's the only of the Virginia founders that comes out of the war, everything intact. He was so rich. He kept it all together. He was something else, but I'll stop on Washington. Yeah.
A question about royalism here in the Old Dominion. It became a thing 50 years ago to, I would say, exaggerate the number of loyalists that were in America. And for a while, 1976 or so, we were hearing a third were loyal to the patriot cause, and a third didn't really care, a third were loyalists. Well, based on these results, I wonder if you would like to comment on the degree of loyalism in Virginia.
Well, what I found is in the House of Burgesses, which should represent every county, as far as the ideology coming out of the counties, you only had about 7 or 8 loyalists, or halfway not supporting the Patriots cause of these documents, out of that 120 or so Burgesses. So that's a pretty small sample size. Obviously, in the southeastern part of the state, Williamsburg, Norfolk was a hotbed, but people say, there is a random loyalist every once in a while you might find up in these areas, but almost all the important people that you come across, that I've come across in these counties, they were supporters of the Patriot. It's hard to find loyalists up here. I mean, it really is. You can find patriots all over the place, and patriots that were early by 74 locked in. But loyalists, I don't see that much sentiment. Obviously, you have some Quaker communities and things that were more against anything involvement, but I wouldn't say they were really opposed to what was going on. They were just trying to stay out of all of that political sentiment. But certainly, a lot of the in Norfolk area, Hampton, more or less Princess Anne counties, things like that. There were a lot of loyalists in that part of the state, but the rest of the areas that I've researched, and most of my research has been up in central part of Virginia and northern Virginia. You don't see many loyalists at all. Not that I've seen.
With all the resolves being published and with it posted from Parliament, how was the government respond? I mean, the government had just dissolved the House, if you will, in the past.
Well, our governor was, it's a strange thing in Virginia. He was, when these resolves were being written, he was out on the frontier in Lord Dunmore's war. He was kind of leading. He let Andrew Lewis was leading, they had their regiments, 2 different regiments split up, and Andrew Lewis was actually ended up in a fight with the Shawnee at Point Pleasant, Battle of Point Pleasant, which is on the Ohio River in current day West Virginia. And that group got beat up pretty bad, including a lot in Culpeper County, some of the leaders. But, that's kind of a crazy subject, because Dunmore, some people say that some of the best fighters he put in the other regiment, and they ended up getting beaten up. Like, that's a plan, I don't know, but it was allowed into the Sons of American Revolution, finally allow that as a battle in the American Revolution. But to get to your point, when he came back to Williamsburg, he was a well-liked governor. But quickly, when he heard about the events that were happening, he became pretty hardcore, solid against what was going on or what had happened with the resolves. And it took him a while to catch up, and he never ever really caught up. The Patriot cause was so strong that he had to leave Williamsburg very quickly. He ended up out on a ship outside and in a protected area, and he would do raids and do as much as he could. But he never had, I mean, we had 5 conventions through that time period, and he was never really able to affect that at all, to impact that. So he was, it was, Virginians had so solidly jumped on the Patriot cause by 1774. And he came back to almost a colony that he had no control over.
Thank you very much, Jim.
There was a question back here.
Yes. Oh, we do have one more question. Yes.
So the research that you've done, most of the data that you collected was publications.
Most of the data that I collected was from the Virginia Gazettes. I ended up, you know, one advantage I have in what they had 50 years ago was most of these things were published 50 years ago, that other the ones known, but obviously I've got the internet, you know, in more recent times. So I was able to find a few others, not many, maybe 4 or 5 that weren't in the Virginia Gazette, but they were in articles like the Loudoun County one and William and Mary Quarterly. A lot of people had missed some of those or couldn't find them at the time. And those are ones that I added. There are 6 that aren't there. Well, they might show up someday. I don't doubt that some of them will show up someday. I couldn't find them, but there might be. But I had a pretty good group of them. You know, there's a pretty big chunk that are there.
And so the information that you have from any maybe correspondence, you never were able to see any correspondence that sort of indicated what they talked about the taverns and things.
There's some letters shared back and forth at the time. I really didn't dig into deeply into correspondence like that at that time period. This was a project that I did last summer more because I had people ask me about it and I didn't know the answer. So that's when I dug deep. So I didn't dig any deeper to see some of the more in-depth meaning, but there's quite a bit of correspondence out there. If someone really wanted to dig deep, they could find it.
So your estimate that there is correspondence out there?
Oh yeah, I'm sure there is. That talked about the Washington. They all in his letters. He talks a little bit about what was going on. So there's correspondence. I just didn't dig that deep.
There is no government record as far as, well, of course, it's all everything, but there's no government writing stuff these resolutions.
Well, they published a lot of their stuff. You know, with the results themselves tell you a lot because most of those were published, including the 89 former purchases, what they stated. So a lot of this stuff that you can gather is out there, easily to find. How they came about to get those, no, I'm not seeing, you know, it would be interesting to find a debate or some of the debate they had in the local counties, why they put that resolve as some of those that they did. I didn't dig that deep. I have no doubt that there's much more depth that could go into this. That sounds like a dissertation for somebody down the road. That was deeper than I was wanting to look at. I was just wanting to look at the results that were published, where they came from, how expansive they were, that type of thing, which tells us a lot.
Is correspondence like sitting out there for libraries?
Well, there's a lot of correspondence you could go to. A lot of the major framers that were in these meetings, their correspondence are in a lot of the local, you know, Virginia State Library. A lot of the university library, University of Virginia has things. George Washington's papers are all over the place, you know, at the Library of Congress and with their editing job there at the University of Virginia. So there's a lot of resources that you could dig deep into analyzing all of that. These were all the more important men of each community of the county. So a lot of their letters do survive.
I just want to acknowledge Jay Harrison from Fredericksburg, having been a student during the American Bicentennial and working in Fredericksburg, and my major interest was the American Revolution. I can tell you this is a clear example of your work of how much scholarship has enhanced our knowledge of the Revolution in the last 50 years, because it was a big deal for Fredericksburg, the misunderstanding about what we pointed out earlier, about it being listed higher in the whole hierarchy of those that resolves that were first on this, and also that how much Fairfax promoted itself based on the known scholarship 50 years ago, and now that that's been straightened out, and not knocking Fairfax, but how much they've dropped down the list and what the real story is, because we know so much more, and this is one of the reasons why we have corporations of this nature, because we're continuing to enhance and understand more over time. It's not rewriting history, rewrite it, but to set the record straight about misconceptions or assumptions that were made. Now we have clear evidence, and that's a big dimension. This is one reason why we do this. And that's astounding work we did. I'm really excited about it.
Well, thank you very much, Jay. I will back up just to add on to one of your comments there. When I was that, for example, in the cherry tree story with Pastor Weems, you know, I was just like everybody else that he made those stories up. And then when I went to actually research the historiography, I realized that it was a historian, name escapes me now. He was one of the major senators of the World War I. Henry Cabot Lodge. Harvard historian Henry Cabot Lodge in 1887, after all of these players are dead with George Washington's writings, he comes out and gives a conference and said that let's throw Weems to the trash heap. Everything that he said was a lie. None of that would have been true. He said that Virginians would have not talked that way in the 1740s and 30s and 50s, like Weems presents them as being talked. And I'm going, how does someone from Boston know how a Virginian would have talked in the 1740s? But anyway, he had so much presence by stating that almost every historian after that started following him. He had no evidence. He just stated those words, and because of his clout, it all turned. There was nobody to defend Weems and the connection. Nobody looked at the close connections of the families, but that has just gained legs tremendously in the century afterwards, to the point where every historian that writes about Washington, they have to first mention, oh, by the way, that's a lie about the cherry tree story. That was all made up by Weems. And when you actually go into the primary source material and their connection, you go, wait a second here. Me, myself, I don't think I would write about my wife's family and lie about it. You know, probably wouldn't be good, but anyway, that's it. So when you talk about, some people were, just because they could, they said stuff that other historians just jump on board. Nobody has any defense of nobody has any evidence about the cherry tree story. It's just funny how things like that can happen. But I will agree with you 100%, Jay, that we have so much more access to records now with the internet and all the scanned documents that 50 years ago during the bicentennial, or even 25 years ago, they just didn't have the resources which we have available to us now, which makes a big difference. Like you said, we're not necessarily undermining them. We're just learning stuff out that changes. It produces a little more of a new paradigm. Well, thank you very much.